Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to have you online on the event to commemorate the 100th birthday of the philosopher Hans Blumenberg. And allow me, before starting, to move very shortly to Hebrew, and then we will come back to English, and then I will introduce our guest, Dr. Rüdiger Zill, and we will open our discussion around this wonderful book on the intellectual biography of Hans Blumenberg. So I will move very shortly to Hebrew, and then we will come back to English. ערב טוב לכולם. אני מאוד שמח לפתוח היום אירוע מיוחד גם עבורי באופן אישי, בגלל העניין החשוב שיש לי ולעוד רבים אחרים בהגות של הנס בלומנברג. מה שאנחנו ננסה לעשות היום זה לנסות להאיר שוב פעם את החשיבות של אחד הפילוסופים המעניינים, הפוריים ביותר בחצי השני של המאה ה-20 בגרמניה, ולספק את זה הפעם דרך נקודת מבט לא מושגית בלבד, אלא גם כזאת שמשלבת איזשהו מבט רחב יותר על ההקשר הביוגרפי, מי היה האיש, איפה הוא צמח, מה הקשר בין הביוגרפיה שלו לעולם האינטלקטואלי העשיר שהוא הוריש לנו, עולם שיש לו ביטויים שונים מתיאוריות של מודרניות ותיאוריות שקשורות למיתוס ועוד דברים רבים ואחרים שבלומנברג עסק בהם. אז כמו שאמרתי, אנחנו מקדישים את הערב הזה לשיחה זאת, סביב פרסום ספר שפורסם בשם הקורא המוחלט, ביוגרפיה אינטלקטואלית של הנס בלומנברג. Okay, I will move again to English. So, good evening again, Dr. Zill. We are very delighted to have you in our webinar in Van Leer to discuss your, as I said, your wonderful book, the absolute leather, Eine intellektuelle Biography, Hans Blumenberg, Eine intellektuelle Biography. I read this book with a great fascination, and I think that it's a wonderful book. And we decided to focus on your book as part of our intention to commemorate this 100th birthday of Hans Blumenberg. I will introduce to you all Dr. Zill, and after that I will address several questions to him, and then after roughly 55 to 1 hour, we will move, if you have any question, we will move to the part of the question of our event. So I want to say something about our guest. Rüdiger Zill is a philosopher and program manager at the Einstein Forum at Potsdam. He worked on intellectual history, theory, and history of emotions and aesthetic. Of course, his most recent publication is the Absolute Leather, Hans Blumenberg, Eine intellektuelle Biographie, that was published this year by Suhrkamp. He also published a book by the name of Poetic und Hermeneutik in Rückblick, interview that he co-edited with Petra Boden. And he also have another book on perspective, Eine Theorie der Unbegrifflichkeit, perspective on a theory of non-conceptuality. He co-edited with Matthias Gross in 2011. And as I said, today we will focus mainly on his latest publication, his intellectual biography of Hans Blumenberg. I want to start by describing in a very short manner the book. The book is contains 3 parts. The first 2 parts are focusing mainly on Hans Blumenberg biography, and the third part is the interesting way in which Dr. Zill suggests us a reading of the intellectual project or the philosophical project of Hans Blumenberg. The two first parts that focus on on his life. The first one focused mainly on a very important event surrounding the school years, especially the last year of the gymnasium, the last year in his high school, which is a very, very important event in the biography of Hans Blumenberg. And the other parts describe the development of the intellectual, let's say, academic biography, the way that he started from starting in the university and then became professor and all his academic career. But I think that the most important and interesting thing is the way the book combined together the life of the philosopher and if we want to say his theory or his intellectual achievement. And I want to open by giving our guest, Dr. Zill, the opportunity to tell us something first in some content about what was so important in these first stages in his life surrounding the school, and maybe how he think about the relationship in general, of course, between the biography and then the intellectual project or the philosophical project of Hans Blumenberg. So we will start with that and then we will continue. Please, Dr. Zill.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and for your kind words about my book on Hans Blumenberg. And well, to begin with, the relationship between the intellectual and the biographical, between life and theory, that is, the question is whether or not that is important at all. I mean, the life for the theory. We know we have lots of biographies, of course, about philosophers and so on, but there are two extreme attitudes to that. One is maybe Heidegger's, who at one point in his talks just mentioned, when he talked about Aristotle, he said, well, Aristotle was born, used to work and died. Now let's turn to his thinking, which very often, not always, but very often is understood as life doesn't matter and thinking is the important thing that interests us. It's like Hegel, for example, who would say that is not the development of the thought, but the äußere Reflexion. Anyway, the other extreme would be Nietzsche, who said, well, these theories are gone anyway. They are démodé, they're past. And what is still important is what can be the concentrated core of it, and that we can put that in three anecdotes, so to speak. Well, but then you can also, of course, ask what are these three anecdotes, and then you are very quick to the question: what is important in a life, and what is important for his theory? And there are always these anecdotes and these myths around philosophers, say, for example, Wittgenstein or Heidegger himself or others as well. And they're always, if you just ask, well, anybody about, say, Descartes, yeah, ego cogito, things like that. Anyway, now, Hans Blumenberg, for the most part of his life, was a, well, professor. He was a professor of philosophy in several German cities, and that, on the first glance, is very, well, not a very exciting life. But there is sort of mythology about his youth, around his youth. And that was, in a way, of course, important for him. Although the question is how much stress we should put on that. And he was, to begin with, he was raised in the German town of Lübeck on the northern Germany, that is the Baltic Sea. and he was the son of a Catholic father and a Jewish mother. So, and he was born in 1920. So you can imagine when the National Socialists came to power, he was 13, and that changed a lot in his life, because he then was what the Nazis called a so-called half Jew. So because of his Jewish mother, who, by the way, when she married his father, Blumenberg's father, in 1919, converted from Jewish religion to, it's a funny thing, because she converted to Protestantism, and only 11 years later she converted to Catholicism, which was the religion of Blumenberg's father, which was, by the way, of great importance for his education in the first years. But nevertheless, in that time, especially when he went to school in Lübeck, he was in a very strange situation. Because of his father and his mother, he was in a sort of double diaspora, because Lübeck and the area around Lübeck was basically mainly Protestant area. And for example, if you look at his school, the Katharineum, which was a very old, very renowned gymnasium, and there were around 150 boys. There were only boys at that school, and only 10 were Jewish and only 2 were Catholic. The rest of them were Protestant. So that is the background he was raised. His father was dealing with prints of artworks, and that was very often religious prints. So that is, he had a even a very Catholic education. He went to primary school with the nuns and so on. But of course, when the Nazis came to power, that was very important for his life, and he could go to school, to the Katharineum, until his Abitur, his examination. But then he was not allowed to. He was the best student of his group, of the whole Katharineum, and even the whole of the Schleswig-Holstein, the area around that. And he was not allowed to deliver the speech for the ceremony at that time, which normally was the task for the best student, for the best pupil. But because of his so-called half-Jewish ancestry, dependency, he was not allowed to do that. The director of the school, he just refused to do that. And that was very, very, among other things as well. Now, of course, that was one of the major memories of his later life. And he always came back to this little scene. He would say there were other things as well, very important situations. So he had, after school, for example, he was not allowed to be a proper and normal student. He went for 2 semesters to a Catholic university in first Paderborn and then Frankfurt am Main. But even that he had to leave, and he had to go to a factory to work as an accountant. And in 1945, he even was deported by the organization TOT to help with building streets, all that. But the very, very strange was that there's a very scene in school that he was not allowed to deliver the speech was the most important memory. He came back later on and again and wrote it to his, he had a very good relationship to his classmates, even in later years, and they wrote letters and so on when he was in Münster and other towns and other universities. But he always came back to this original scene.
So I want to ask you about exactly that, because you know, the first time that I started my interest with Blumenberg, there was this image of Blumenberg as someone that wrote wonderful work and wonderful book, but we don't know nothing about his personality, nothing about his biography, etc. One of the things that this caused a lot of people to speak about him in a kind of mystic way, about someone that is retreat to some place he don't want to see or to be involved in the public sphere. And he will all the time retreat, and all the time they like to describe him as someone that is retreat to his intellectual cave or intellectual safe place. And this kind of description of this biography of this man during my coming to know his philosophical work was all the time a kind of image, a mythological image about his biography. And after I read your book, because they gave you this access to all the material, family albums, family correspondence, and all the huge material that you read in Marbach, where all his archive is kept. We came to a totally different way of evaluating this biography, because right now we know much more. And as you said, we know that there is this event, this one event that seems like a small one, that but important from his perspective, as an event that, this is my question now, if this event can be found later on his on the subject that he dealt with. I give you only one example. I will speak about his last book. His last famous book is what they call The Cave Exit. And the image of this cave exit is about someone that cannot handle something and is need to retreat to some safe place as an image. Now, when we read the biographical description of someone that have this kind of traumatic events in which you need all the time to keep a distance from him, but still work on him, it seems that people will tend to reduce his philosophy to this event. So by giving us so much material about these events, I think that there is this kind of suspicion that instead of listening to what you have to say philosophically, we all the time will read it in a biographical way. Have you any kind of, I don't want to call it regret, but any thought about that now, especially after your book and about the emphasis that you give to his biographical aspects, that people will tend now to say it's a life work of someone that all his life and also all his intellectual project was around his biographical events or the traumatic events that happened to him in 39 until 45. So how you see this kind of relationship is if this kind of discovery don't let us to read Blumenberg in a way that reduce him to something, to the biographical things. So this is my question.
You see, I think we have to be very careful about that. That is a very obvious solution and a very obvious way of talking about that. Many people do that. And they say, well, Cave X is his last book. And then he had, for a couple of weeks, to hide in March and April 1945. He had to hide in Lübeck in a safe place in a room. And so on. Well, there's a connection. And anyway, I mean, the book is about the Platonic simile, the Platonic allegory of the cave. Well, but nevertheless, I mean, if you want, you always can do that and you can draw the connections. But, well, in the end, it doesn't help us to, I mean, we wouldn't read a huge work, a huge bulk of papers and books and articles and so on, if it comes down to one of these very simple explanations. So, I mean, what I had in mind you have to deal with these anecdotes, the Nietzschean way to reduce a life and a theory to 3 anecdotes in a way. But in the end, you have to do, to write 800 pages, you have to write a bit more and do a bit more. And my idea was to analyze Blumenberg's philosophy and Blumenberg's thinking, and that what is important for us, for us as readers of his work, in 3 stages or from three different angles. And one is, as you said, the biographical, which is a lot more of these sceneries, these anecdotes from his youth. The second part, we will come to that later, I think, is this kind of manufacturing, I would say, theory of working on it, the work on myth of his own work, like it's not only genius, but also hard work. And the third one is the development of the theory. And that is important. It is a development of the theory. And there is a different logic to this. There's a logic of its own for the development of theories. And the interesting question is how these 3 parts interact and what kind of influence is between the 3. And to come back, to return to the first strain of ideas, to his life, the myth around the troglodyte Blumenberg, so the one that hides in his, especially after his retirement when he was 65, he retired from university, and he went immediately to his retreat. That means his house in Altenberge, village near Münster, where he had his last professorship, and he hardly ever came out of his study, and at least never walked around, went to any other conferences or to had any vacations or things like that. He just simply were at home and wrote and read and wrote and so on. But this was late Blumenberg, and that was not the person from the beginning. And one of the ideas, or one of my important, what was important from my description of his life was to show how he himself developed from a very, from a person who was very orientated to his surroundings as well, to other people as well. And when he was young in the 1950s, he even tried to be a sort of public intellectual. He began by writing for newspapers. He wrote not only a number, or quite a lot of reviews about books, but also essays for, not very important newspapers like Düsseldorfer Nachrichten. Even in Germany, nobody would know this paper anymore. But that was very important for him in terms of practicing, important of learning to write. And as I said, he wanted to be sort of public intellectual. He had the big ideas and even wrote about, the report on sexuality and so on. And then in the late 1950s, and when he has his first professorships, the first important professorship was in Gießen from 1960 to 1965. He was a very communicative man, because then he founded he was a co-founder of a very influential German research group, Poetics and Hermeneutics, that was an interdisciplinary research group. And you see, that is one very important thing in his the development of his philosophy. It from the beginning, from his first years at the university in Kiel, where he wrote his dissertation and where he got his habilitation, and he was in Kiel for more than a decade, he was very orientated to other sciences and humanities and social sciences as well. And he was always in conversation with his colleagues. And that was even more so in Gießen in the 1960s. And it was only when he went from his next step, Bochum, to his final university destination, which is in Münster, where he is famous for. He just then began to hide in a way, but this hiding was not, and was very, very open hiding in the first years, because he was famous for not discussing with people, not with his students, but he always had, I mean, he had some obligations to teach, of course, and normally you would have Vorlesungen, talks and seminars, and you would, part of the time we would discuss and deal with your students. After a couple of years in Münster, he refused to do that. He was simply at his desk in front of his students and just talking, and not even allowing any questions. He said, if you have any questions, just write it down, send me, give me the paper, and I will try to answer it next week. But he was, I'm pretty sure that he was extremely aware of his appearance. And he was pretty aware of how the reaction of these people in the room was. And there was a huge audience, and even people from the city, ordinary people, came to listen to him, not only students. And that was very important for him, that his public appearance, at least not, well, not in talk shows or so, but this public appearance in the university and in the city of Münster was extremely important for him. And then even after his retirement, it was not that he just simply wrote big books to be published in the Suhrkamp Verlag. No, he also started to write articles for then important newspapers like the Frankfurter Allgemeine or the Neue Zürcher. And it was great fun for him. And that was, again, if you will, if you like, a sort of return to his early youth and the writing for the newspapers in the 1950s. And he again started to even change his attitude, his style of writing. He began to write as an essayist. So he was not only the philosopher with these very, very, very difficult theoretical books. And if you take one of these published things of his later years, like Cave Access, Höhlenausgänge, or the Genesis of the Copernican Revolution, and so on, that have some of them very hard to grasp. He always had, on the other hand, these essays in the Neue Zürcher or the FAZ, and that was important for him. So that was not only hiding, it was sort of very obvious hiding. He always showed his hiding as an attitude.
I'm very happy that you said that, because I think it's a very important contribution to the shift in images, that because I thought that after your explanation that a lot of people was all the time emphasizing the biography, and in the way that you explained that, you demystified this story. But I want to move now to more to the, let's call it theoretical or philosophical merits of one of your interesting way of reading Blumenberg. I will just summarize it very shortly and say that people that are acquainted with Blumenberg theoretical work, you know that it starts with one of its original idea about metaphorology, the idea that there is a very interesting conceptual relationship between metaphor and concept. And he started in the beginning to do a kind of history of metaphors. And in the beginning, he said that he's doing that as a tool to a history of ideas, that through that, he can give us an history of idea that is richer, because instead of saying that only about the context, we can take one metaphor, for example, the metaphor of light, and is signifying the idea of true, and following it, and then you give a very interesting idea of the concept of true, for example. And he's doing that in the early years, around the 50s, and then in the 60s, and then he came back to that later. And a lot of people say that the shift, the important shift to another perspective of his theory happened around the 70s, when he started to being very interested in an anthropological question. The question about man and the condition for his passability or condition for his survival. And there is this famous article that he published about the anthropological idea. And a lot of people thought that there is here a shift that they need to explain and to understand what kind of shift happened between them. And if we can find a way to recombine them together to one systematic whole. And in the Blumenberg scholarship, there is a lot of dispute about that. People argue for that or against that, etc. My question to you, how your concept of absolute leisure or the absolute reader, is it part of this discussion, or is it something that you say, this is my perspective to understand something about his theory or his way of doing theory? So my question is absolute reader is another component to understand this, let's call systematical wall, or it's only manifest or emphasize the interesting way in which Blumenberg was working? So this is my question.
Yeah, thank you. That is a very interesting point. Actually, there are several points to that. And one is the question about the absolute reader. And the other big thing is about the development of his theory. And if I may start with this part, it was, for me, it was always important to put stress on the development, and not to, I mean, there are different approaches to his philosophy, to his thinking so far. The most obvious, easy way is just to retell the line of his books, so the big books in order of appearance, so to speak, in order of publications. And then at one point, there was the search for a unifying idea behind that, say. And Blumenberg's colleague and friend Udo Marquardt was the first one to just to have a concept for that, and he called it the Entlastung vom Absoluten, which is sort of gaining distance of the absolute, relief of the absolute. And there were others to follow him, saying that that is a basic idea, and if you just read Blumenberg's book, you always have this idea in different perspectives, in different modes. And I mean, that is not totally wrong. You can do that. You can read that line, and it's probably very helpful to begin with his work. But then, if you have a closer look, it's very interesting that there is a very development in many phases in a way. And my point for that is not a teleological development, that the anthropology, and of course it's true, there is, among other turning points, there is a very important turning point around, say, 1970 to the more anthropological theory. But I wouldn't say that this is the ultimate aim he was going to. For me, and by the way, that is the important idea behind the second part, which dealt with the how Blumenberg worked, and how he what you can see from the archives, from his papers, the unpublished papers. So how was he doing that? How was he experimenting there? And I would say that lots of his books, lots of his articles, lots of his ideas, lots of his lines of thought were always the result of intellectual experiments as well. So he not only had an idea, and then that was one point, by the way, he had an idea and then looking for the material, of course. And very, very famous are his card boxes, his Zettelkästen, where he always collected quotations from 2,500 years of philosophical and intellectual history. But on the other hand, he was always a very playful mind. He always tried to recombine articles, passages of his texts, recombine ideas. And he was very much, at least for the first years, in touch with these people who he was writing for. For example, the editors of newspaper, and they said, well, we are working on a journal or for an issue of the journal on, say, the mythology of light or so. Do you have any contribution for that? And then he was starting to think about that. And he, of course, he connected that to what he was working on anyway. But then that was very important to give him impulses to go farther and to follow up his line of thought. And if you look even at the big books in terms of like 800, 900 pages, work on myth, the work on the genesis of the modern world view, and so on, they always have a long, long history, starting with little articles, which by then were put together to bigger books, and then even yet another big book, and so on. And they were developing over time, and they were not. They were always. Blumenberg always tried to follow the idea in different directions, and that was even important for his theory. He always it was very important for him to make the point that the history of ideas is not neither just, say, secularization, neither the result of what was going on, the result of the past, nor just fulfillment of a telos, for example, but the result of history in a strong sense. And the same is true for his own philosophy. And it culminated, if you like, in a late idea, which, well, came up in the 70s as well, but then it was formulated in his talk at Darmstadt when he was dedicated the Sigmund Freud Prize for scientific writing in 1980 in Darmstadt. And this talk he delivered there was called Nachdenklichkeit, pensiveness in English. And this concept of pensiveness he developed in this speech was that, for example, if you interpret anecdotes or fables or myths or other texts, you always have to look not for a final interpretation, but to leave ways to reinterpret it again and again, have new interpretations. And that was exactly what he did. You can see, for example, during his whole life, certain topics which came up again and again and were reformulated and rethought again. And that is sometimes very interesting, how many different perspectives he could see in one anecdote, for example, or in one myth. So the openness of his thinking is, I think, very important for theory and for his own thing as well.
Okay, but exactly in this point, I think that we need to admit that he a little bit play with us. I totally agree with you about this openness because of this anecdote and the playfulness, etc. But there is another side of him. I will give you one example for it. Let's say on the book on Thales, for example, it's about an anecdote about Thales and what's happened to Thales and how his maid told him that, you know, instead of looking to the sky, look at what in front of you. But over there in this book, that it seems like, again, playfulness, he wants to say something very positive about the origin of theory. So my question is playing with us? I mean that he raises the stake to say, you know, I'm playing with you, I give you this anecdote and what Nietzsche made with anecdote, etc. But at the same time, he can say sentences like, I want to speak about the proto-history or the Urgeschichte of history. So do you think that it's a consciousness act of irony, of playfulness, or just to make us crazy as a reader that say from the one side, you play with us, from the other side, you claim this strong, very strong philosophical claim. So,
as you said it, I mean, it's absolutely right. You said at the same time, there are always two sides to his, well, most of his books at least. And the book on the Thales anecdote is a very, very good example for that, because then he just retells the reception of that certain, that special anecdote that is told for the first time in Plato's dialogue, the Aethetos. And that is a very influential story, little story that is over the years told again and again, told in different attitudes, different forms, different perspectives with different endings and so on. But Blumenberg follows all these, the whole history. And that sometimes you would say, well, isn't that simply the celebration of his card box? So do I have to know whether or not this thinker of the late antiquity or the, 15th century, what he had in mind about this anecdote? But on the other hand, if you have a closer look, I mean, this is probably true as well, but on the other hand, there is, as you said, there is a certain idea behind that. And it is a reflection, a philosophical reflection on philosophy in terms of non-conceptuality. And I mean, somebody like Blumenberg, who developed, first of all, the so-called metaphorology, and then developed it further and opened it up to something that he called the theory of non-conceptuality, which includes not only metaphors, but other forms of non-conceptual thinking. Then it was important to have a kind of reflection on this in terms of non-conceptuality itself, and that you can find in this book on Thales and the when he was his anecdote. Anyway,
but if we can a little bit, I want to follow this and to ask you the following question. And it's regarding the title of your book that use also this adjective absolute. So we know that Blumenberg, considered by many as a skeptic, as you said, someone that believe in openness, someone that believe in perspective, and sometimes they compare him and they make this kind of comparison between him and to what's happened in France in the 60s or 70s, like Derrida and Foucault, you know, idea that we don't have any ground or essence to reality and that we can only give some perspective, but we cannot have this essence. But strangely enough, Blumenberg, like the way that you choose to call your book, is going again and again to this concept of absolute. For example, absolute metaphor is exactly the metaphor that conceptuality cannot enter, call it like that, or the absolute of reality, or the absolutism of reality. So I thought that why, again, this absoluteness, can we read it as just what people like to call it as a limit concept, why we cannot really get to the absolute? Mm-hmm. Or maybe if we will go back to the beginning of our conversation, is to some kind of events that I cannot really overcome, and this is the meaning of the absolute. So my question is, how you read or how you interpret it, because people ask me all the time about that, this absolute, why use this term absolute? Mm-hmm. Theological absolutism, absolute metaphor, etc. It's a kind of playing between metaphysics and undermining metaphysics at the same time, or metaphysical philosophical claim. So this is my...
Absolute is a very interesting and dangerous concept for Blumenberg. And you can find it very often during his, in the whole work. And it appeared as early as in the late 1940s, early 1950s, like in his in a review of Kafka's letter to to his father, and it was Blumenberg's text was called "The Absolute Father," and for the most part, absolute is a negative thing for Blumenberg. It's something you have to get rid of, to distance yourself for that, because it's overwhelming. It's something that is an enemy of your freedom. And Blumenberg, by the way, was a philosopher of freedom as well, and that was one of his driving forces. And so, at the absolutism of reality, the absolute father, the absolutism of the late medieval God, and so on, there were negative terms. And one of the very few, in a way, positive meanings of absolute is the absolute metaphor. And absolute in this sense only means that it is not reducible to a concept. And it's always a metaphor which cannot be reformulated in a theoretical sense. So the absolute reader is in a way in between. I mean, it's not a very important point in his work, but we can find it. And by the way, there's a match to this, that the absolute author. And the absolute reader is something who is, again, something that fights against your freedom, because that is the idea that somebody, Schopenhauer as an example, there's a little text by Blumenberg where he retells an episode from Schopenhauer, who said to his students, whoever sits here listens to my talk, I want you to have read all my books. You don't have to be here without having read my whole work till now. So in this sort of absolutism of absolute claim of the author via his vis-a-vis his readers, well, I would say that Blumenberg was fascinated, because of course he knows that was devastating. And on the other hand, it was his own hidden wish, say, that he could find readers so fascinated by his own work that they would follow his thinking and his pages, 100 pages of intellectual history. I mean, that takes a lot of time of your life to read this. So that is, you have to be to deliver yourself to be in a way, a victim of your author. And Blumenberg knew about that, of course, but and he played with it as well. And when he was retired, he published a number of big books, but then only 3 years later, or 4 years later, he stopped doing that and just reworked his papers, being aware that there were people coming after him to publish that there were that he would have students or anybody else who will do the work for him. He was convinced that what he had left, or what he had to leave, was important enough. So in a way, maybe he did not play with the idea of the absolute reader for his works, but he did at least play with the idea of very, very interested readers.
Another short question regarding what you say about is being conscious that people will go to his archive and will publish or will publish part of it. And I want to ask you a question that a lot of people ask in the last years, because after it is dead, we have now roughly the same number of books that published during his lifetime. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, was already published after his death. So I mean, this kind of industry that taking is a book from the archive and publish them again and again, there is this discussion if we are doing some kind of the right decision not to keep them in the only in their archive and leave them unpublished, because people say what we are now doing with this enormous material and with all these new books that he never intend to publish. So if I understand your way of reading is you saying that he was also have in mind that they will publish them. So if you can first, what do you think about this industry of publishing a lot of things from the archives? And the other things, if you can say something, elaborate a little bit about the idea that you think that he was sure, he was positive that people will do that.
So one point is, should we do that? And the other point is, what was his idea behind that? As I said, I'm pretty convinced that he was aware and he was relying on the idea or relying on the fact that his papers will be published. So he's not like Kafka. He said, "Well, burn my papers. I don't want to be that you do whatever you like with that. Just burn it." No, he was organizing his estate. It was in clear order. Well, at least he was in a very good shape, so that we could find it and then we could work with it. And he did that, as I said, expecting us to do that. The other question in this respect is whatever appeared after his death in the very shape he wanted to publish it? And that is a difficult question, because I'm sure that you cannot say this is the author's will, because the author did in certain moments he did not know what his own will was, in a way, because, as I said, he was combining and recombining the part of his text, and that was a process, an ongoing process. And at one point he died, so there is no the final shape of his work, and so we have to deal with it. We have to do our own decisions. So it is. The other point is, why do we do that? You see, are we slaves of this absolute author? And that is a very simple. There's a very simple answer to that. As long as we are interested in his work, as long as there are people who buy that to read him, it's fine, it's okay. I mean, we wouldn't do that if that was an interesting work. And that's the point. We have to talk about what is interesting about his work. And for me, there was, to speak of myself, why did I do that? Why did I write this biography, for example? And for me, again, there are two different aspects to that. And one is the fascinating state of his estate, of his papers. You can find these thousands and thousands of papers in Marbach at the Deutsche Literaturarchiv, the archive, where his collected and his unpublished papers are now. It's not only the manuscripts, which were still a lot of manuscripts are not published yet, but also all around the card boxes, the letters, a lot of lists about his daily writing, about his daily readings, Lektürelisten, for example, and so on. The point is that for certain periods of his life, you have nearly a photography of his mind and action. You can see, for example, March 31st, 1977. You know what he read on this very day. You know what he has written, he wrote on this very day. You know, maybe even his lectures and so on. And then he is not only the famous philosopher Hans Blumenberg, who is of course interesting for us as a certain philosopher, but he's also an exemplary man, because you can see, at least in certain respect, how the machinery of thinking is going on. It's not only that his philosophy is philosophy in action in general, that that I was interested in his theory as a theory in motion, but that you can see something, or you can discover something behind that motion. You see the driving forces, the machinery. And I think you can learn a lot from his self-documentation about the whole way of thinking of humanities, of philosophy. And so it's more that, I mean, it's an interesting theory, and we talked a bit about it, and maybe we do that a bit more. But apart from his special attitude, it's a general, it's a topic of general interest. And I don't know any other author, any other philosopher who was so obsessive in a way about self-documentation as Blumenberg was, and where you can find all these things and you can relate his readings. And that's what I call the book, The Absolute Reader. It's also the way of, I mean, there are people who refuse to, or they wanted to be philosophers of their own right. So just look at the phenomena and think about it and say what is going on. Or on the other hand, you have philosophy developing from reading, you see. And he was that was Blumenberg. He was a hermeneutic philosopher. And he was very aware, and that was part of his theory, by the way, that he was very aware that all our thinking is not something that just comes from genius or from just observation, just what we can think, just look at the things, you see. That he was aware that we were guided by our concepts, by our metaphors. So we have to discover, we have to investigate into our intellectual, our Geistesgeschichte, because that is something that influences our own thinking. We are just sort of a result of our history. And so we have to reconstruct our own thinking and our way of worldview by reconstructing this history. There's no way out in a way. And that's why he was very, very angry when people like his colleagues called him, oh, he is a mere philosopher, he is a mere historian of philosophy, he's not a philosopher proper, because that was a huge misunderstanding of what was his philosophy. It's not only that comes after philosophy or just on just by the way or so. It's philosophy proper. It's the very heart of philosophy. It's the core of our thinking that we have to reconstruct our mental mind, our state of mind.
It's a highly, it's highly interesting and very tempting for me not to go to something that come to my mind following your last comment about the obsessiveness and documentation, self-documentation is a way in which he's trying to try to relive one of the figures that for him was very important is Goethe. If you think about Goethe in the sense that he had the Ackermann and all the people that documented his life to letters, etc. But it will take us another full conversation to think about this last issue that you raised via the perspective of the role that Goethe played in his overall. But it's come to my mind because you spoke about the idea of self-documentation. You think about Wahrheit, Dichtung und Wahrheit, and all this enormous way in which Goethe described his life exactly as you said, that we know every day what he did, what he read, etc. And it seems that the way that you described that gave me an insight why Goethe was a very important figure for him. But it will take us to, as I said, to another. My last question is a question that is more of interest to let's call it the Israeli or the Jewish audience, is that as you know, there is in Israel especially, and also I think in United States, there is this field, academic field that think about the relationship between German and Jew, all this subculture, this important subculture that for a lot of people in Israel and the Jewish consciousness, it's one of the important period that this symbiosis or this connection between German and Jew created one of the richest and very productive period in the Jewish history. And there is a tendency by some people to try to draw, because of the biographical thing that you mentioned, to try to draw Blumenberg to be a figure like Hannah Arendt, Hans Jonas, Gershom Scholem. And my question is, following your vast research in the archive and following the way that you know very well the biography of Hans Blumenberg, can we do this kind of drawing to this subculture and say that in a sense is also one of the product of this German Jew consciousness? So I will be happy to hear your comments to this idea or to this question. Yeah.
Well, very interesting, very difficult question. Probably yes and no, but well, I think it's more no than yes, because he was not, you see, if you compare him to Hannah Arendt or Günther Anders or the Frankfurt School or, well, lots of other people, they were part of a Jewish background in a way, where they were raised, for example, Siegfried Krakauer, he was for a couple of years only. I mean, Krakauer died in 1965 or 66, and Blumenberg got in touch with him in the early 1960s, and there was a correspondence between them, and they met at the Poetings and Hermeneutics conferences. So they liked each other, I think, and they were very interested in their respective thinking. Nevertheless, there was a huge difference, because Krakauer, for example, he was raised in the Jewish surroundings. He went to a Jewish school, for example, and that was completely different with Blumenberg. He was, I mean, he was younger. So, and then I mentioned that already, that he was born in Lübeck, in a very, very different surroundings. And he hardly had any contact with other Jewish thinkers at that time, or Jewish friends. Unfortunately, don't know very much about his mother. I mean, what their influence, what her influence could have been. I mean, she died as early as in October 1945. And so, yeah, we don't know. I mean, there probably was an influence, but there was no, we have no hard facts for that. So the intellectual development was very different between Blumenberg on the one side and Krakauer or Adorno or Jonas on the other side, of course. But then, I mean, if it comes to theoretical details, say, that is sometimes very surprising how close Blumenberg is, even to people he did not like very much. There was a take for example Adorno. He was in touch with Adorno, and Adorno again, he also died very early in 1969. So they had an exchange of a few letters, and Blumenberg at that time read the Negative Dialectic, so on. But he was always mocking him. And even in the later years, he made fun about Adorno's style of writing, and he was very, very distancing himself from it. But then on the other hand, if you have a closer look to that, there were elements, there were attitudes, there were points in their respective theory very, very similar. And well, then we can start thinking about that. Why is that the similarity? And maybe it's a question of time. Nevertheless, the ones Blumenberg relied on, the thinkers in his time were non-Jewish thinkers like, for example, Rothacker or even Gehlen, or which is very strange point. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, but still, there is only one thing that I know that you know. Of course, when the archive published his comments, very short comments on Hannah Arendt and Freud regarding the timing of publishing Freud, Moses and the Monotheism, and Hannah Arendt piece on Eichmann, we know from the archive that he attacked them very harshly because of their attitude. And you think that he did that regardless his Jewish, I don't know, call it Jewish background? He did that because he thought that morally was not the right move, because people that read it from the perspective of Jewish history think here is someone that want to criticize these two Jews, and he allowed to do that as being someone that is part of this community. So this is my last question. Okay.
Yeah, well, Hannah Arendt is a very interesting point. I think I mean, to put it like that, we are interested in what we are interested in. I mean, and that is different from what Blumenberg was interested in. So for us, Hannah Arendt and Blumenberg's relation to Hannah Arendt is far more important than for himself. I mean, he knew her from very early on, from the late 1940s, and he, of course, but he read articles. I don't think he read her basic books, for example. But anyway, he knew what her basic ideas were and so on. Nevertheless, that very prominent piece you mentioned about Moses the Egyptian, if we have a closer look how it came into being, so to speak, one could, I personally would read it differently, for example, because this is, the Hannah Arendt part is the second part of the text, which started about Freud and the man Moses. And the Hannah Arendt part was probably written a couple of years later than the Moses part, the Freud part. And it is interesting that he had an obsessive and very critical relationship to Freud in the late 1970s. And he even wrote a huge, well, not huge, but a longer manuscript, Ausgeträumte Träume, about Freud and his academic career. It's not published yet, but he was very critical, and especially he was not very fond of the idea of having a so-called para-theory. That is a theory that explains that every critical remark against or towards my own theory is wrong because the critical attitude confirms my truth, so to speak, and that these mechanisms to capture my enemies and to turn it into somebody who confirms my theories, he thought that was not very reliable or not very good theory. So he was very, very critical of Freud, and he wrote lots and lots of pages on Freud, and also this man Moses the Egyptian. And only later he discovered that this Hannah Arendt argumentation would fit to this as well, which does not mean, of course, that he didn't believe that. But then I think he wouldn't have written that 20 or 30 years ago, or before that. It was written, say, probably in 1985. He wouldn't have written it in 1955, for example. He had a very different attitude to that. And it was only in 1985, after lots of experiences, that he turned around and that he was more aware of the history of the state of Israel, for example, and then about Jewishness and so on, that he turned or he changed his view a bit. But it was, if you say, for example, if you look at his correspondence with Hans Jonas in the middle of the 1950s, you see a completely different approach to it.
Exactly. Good, we already surpassed our time in 12 minutes. I hope that nobody is angry with us. So I want to thank you very, very much for this wonderful discussion and wonderful conversation about the wonderful biography that you wrote. And I will now ask if there is any question from the audience, and if there is a question, I will be happy to deliver it to Dr. Zill. And so we will wait 1 or 2 minutes, and if there is question, so we will take them. But again, I want to thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. And I hope that, I don't know, sooner than later, that this book will publish, at least will translate it into the English, because it's, as I said, it's a great book. And I think that a lot of people will have through it some way of more knowledge about Blumenberg the man, and also Blumenberg the thinker. So, but it seems that we don't have a question, but we will give it another 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you for that you organized the opportunity for me to present my my book and my ideas. And well, we'll see whether there will be a translation of the book into English or not. But that, of course, depends on the interest in his work, in Blumenberg's work, in the English-speaking world, of course. And as far as I can see, there is, I mean, there was a first, there were the first translations in the 1980s already by Robert Wallace, the big books, and then there was the little rest, and now more and more of these books are translated in English as well. And I dare to say that there is an ongoing and even rising interest in Blumenberg in the United States, in Australia, in Britain, and in the other English-speaking countries as well.
Yeah, I think that you are right, but I think that mainly is more book that in which you can see is a unique style of thinking and writing, and not these big books. I mean, books like Care Crossing the River, or books like Shipwreck with the Spectator. As I told you, also because we translated into Hebrew in Israel, I was quite surprised that the people that find it interesting was people that coming from the art schools more than people that coming from philosophy, because the imagination and the way that he dealing with the issue and the way that he's writing captured their mind. And I think that my experience with the larger philosophical book, the three main works, Modernity, Copernicus, and Work on Myth, was there is some people that say we don't really understand what he wants. Sometimes you see nice point and or nice argument, or interesting argument, but where to locate this book? I think one of the interesting thing about Blumenberg that is an outsider in a lot of sense. Even though he wrote a book about history of ideas, like the one on art, on the Copernican revolution, and you know that you try to convince people to read it as being a standard work in a history of science. A lot of people say we understand that it's full of knowledge, etc., but they don't know what to do with it. For example, the Copernican book. So,
yeah, I mean, again, this is more or less the result of the older Blumenberg, because he is seen as an enigmatic philosopher. His style is difficult. But if you have a closer look to the earlier articles and books, they are at some point very clear, and you can, it's only the result of this working and reworking on it that it's getting more and more complicated. And I think he was even proud of being enigmatic at a certain point of his career. So these enigmatic, or these smaller texts, very condensed texts, are sometimes hard to understand just because of his his way of making detours, which was programmatic.
Yeah, I want to, because there is, it seems that people don't have any questions, so I want to finish exactly with what I think making me very interesting, as I all the time say to my students when they complain that it's so difficult to read him, I say that it's difficult, but it's all the time worthwhile. You know, you learn a lot. You can see, as I think you put it very, very interesting, in a very interesting way. You see how a thinker works through his books, because it is not building them as you expected to. Here is my thesis, and from this I follow X and Y and Z, etc. But you can follow his way of doing that through reading it. It's very hard sometimes. So, but I just want to join you by saying that it's difficult, but it's worthwhile. So again, thank you very much for your willingness to do this event with us, and we hope that we will continue to spread the message of Blumenberg in Israel and in other places. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Bye.